The restaurant in Nairobi was warm and full of laughter that evening. Naledi Okafor sat beside her husband Tund Adeyemi, feeling proud and happy. Her family had gathered to celebrate her promotion at work. Plates of food covered the table, glasses clinked together, and everyone seemed to be enjoying the night. Naledi had worked very hard for this moment, and seeing her parents, relatives, and younger sister Zuri smiling made her feel grateful. At first, everything felt perfect, but then something happened that Naledi would never forget. Tund suddenly laughed loudly, leaning back in his chair as if he had just remembered a funny joke. Everyone looked at him, curious. With a playful smile on his face, he said, "Honestly, I think I married the wrong sister. Zuri is much better." For a second, the entire table went silent. The laughter stopped. Forks paused in midair. Naledi felt her chest tighten as if the air had disappeared from the room. Across the table, Zuri gave an awkward little smile, clearly unsure how to react. Their parents quickly forced small laughs, pretending it was just a harmless joke. Naledi forced herself to smile too, even though her heart felt like it had cracked open right there at the dinner table. She didn't want to create a scene. She told herself maybe it really was just a joke. But the words kept echoing in her mind. "I married the wrong sister." The rest of the dinner passed in a blur. People kept talking, laughing, and eating, but Naledi barely heard anything. She just sat there quietly, feeling smaller with every minute. Later that night, during the drive home, she finally spoke. "Tund, what you said at dinner really hurt me." Tund barely looked at her as he drove. He shrugged casually and said, "Oh, come on, Naledi. You're being too sensitive. It was just a joke." Everyone laughed, but Naledi knew the truth. No one had really laughed. She turned her face toward the window and stayed quiet for the rest of the ride. The city lights passed by, but her mind was racing. When they got home, Tund went to bed like nothing had happened. But Naledi couldn't sleep. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment again and again. And slowly, something disturbing began to surface in her memory. All the little moments she had ignored before. The way Tund always complimented Zuri's looks. The long conversations they shared at family gatherings. The way he laughed harder at her jokes than anyone else's. For the first time, Naledi started to wonder something she had never allowed herself to think before. What if that joke at dinner wasn't really a joke at all? Naledi barely slept that night. Tund's words from the dinner kept repeating in her mind like a broken recording. "I married the wrong sister." At first she tried to convince herself it was only a careless joke. But the more she thought about it, the more old memories began to return. Growing up in Lagos, Nigeria, Naledi had always lived in the shadow of her younger sister, Zuri Okafor. Zuri had a kind of beauty that people noticed the moment she walked into a room. She was confident, funny, and full of energy. At family gatherings, everyone gathered around her. Aunties praised her style, cousins laughed at her jokes, and uncles called her the star of the family. Meanwhile, Naledi was the quiet one. She focused on her studies, worked hard, and rarely tried to compete for attention. Naledi never hated her sister. In fact, she often protected her. When they were younger, Naledi helped Zuri with homework, defended her when cousins teased her, and shared everything she had. But deep down, Naledi had always felt invisible standing next to her. Even when Naledi met Tund years later, Zuri somehow became part of that story too. At first it seemed harmless. When Naledi and Tund got engaged, Zuri joked that she had approved him as a good husband. Everyone laughed. After the wedding, Zuri visited their home often. She would walk in like she lived there, dropping her bag on the couch and filling the house with her loud laughter. Tund always seemed happy to see her. Sometimes Naledi would come into the living room and find them already deep in conversation, laughing about something she didn't understand. They had their own little inside jokes. If Naledi asked what they were talking about, Tund would simply smile and say, "Nothing important." At the time, Naledi ignored the feeling in her chest. She told herself it was normal. After all, Zuri was her sister. Of course they could talk and laugh together. But now, after what happened at the dinner in Nairobi, those memories didn't feel innocent anymore. Naledi began replaying small moments she had forgotten before. The way Tund often complimented Zuri's outfits. The way he always defended her during family arguments. If anyone criticized Zuri, Tund would immediately jump in and say, "You're misunderstanding her." He rarely defended Naledi like that. One memory suddenly stood out in Naledi's mind. Months ago, during a family barbecue, someone joked that Zuri and Tund had the same personality. Tund had laughed and said, "Maybe that's why we get along so well." At the time, Naledi had laughed too. But now that memory made her stomach twist. For the first time, Naledi began to question everything she once believed was harmless. The laughter, the compliments, the long conversations, and a painful thought slowly formed in her mind. Maybe that humiliating comment at dinner wasn't really a joke. Maybe it was the truth Tund had been hiding for years. After the uncomfortable dinner in Nairobi, life was supposed to return to normal. At least that's what Tund seemed to think. He acted like nothing important had happened. He went to work, watched television in the evenings and joked casually like always. But for Naledi something had changed. Once a small doubt enters your mind, it is very hard to ignore it. Over the next few days, Naledi began noticing things she had never paid attention to before. Small things, strange things, things that suddenly didn't feel right. The first thing she noticed was Tund's phone. Before that dinner, Tund never cared where his phone was. Sometimes he left it on the kitchen counter or the living room table while he showered. But now it was always in his hand. If he stood up, the phone went with him. If he went to the bathroom, the phone went with him. Even when it buzzed, he would quickly turn the screen away from Naledi. At first she told herself she was overthinking. But then something else started happening. Tund suddenly began having many late meetings. Almost every evening he would say the same thing while grabbing his keys. I have to meet a client. Or, there's a work issue I need to handle. Sometimes he didn't come home until very late at night. Naledi would sit alone in their quiet house, staring at the clock and wondering why things suddenly felt so different. At the same time, Zuri's behavior also changed. Normally Zuri called Naledi almost every day. She loved chatting, gossiping and sharing small stories about her life. But after the dinner her calls became shorter. Sometimes she didn't answer at all. When they did talk, Zuri sounded distracted, almost nervous. Naledi couldn't explain it, but something felt wrong. One afternoon a few days later, Naledi was visiting a small cafe in Lekki after finishing some errands. Tund had joined her for coffee before heading to another meeting. They sat together for a while talking casually. Then Tund got up suddenly. I need to take this call outside, he said, quickly grabbing his jacket. But in his hurry he left his phone on the table. Naledi didn't plan to touch it. She simply stared at it for a moment while sipping her coffee. Then suddenly the screen lit up with a new message notification. Naledi's eyes moved to the screen without thinking. And in that single second her entire body froze. The message showed a name she knew very well. Zuri. Next to the name was a small red heart emoji. Naledi's fingers tightened around her cup as her heart began beating faster. Her hands started shaking slightly. She looked around the cafe, suddenly feeling like the room had become too quiet. She tried to breathe slowly. Maybe it meant nothing, she told herself. Maybe Zuri sent that emoji by accident. Maybe they were just joking about something harmless. But deep inside Naledi felt a cold, heavy feeling spreading through her chest. A terrifying possibility had just entered her mind. And no matter how hard she tried, she could not push it away. A few days after the message incident in Lekki, Naledi tried to act like everything was normal. She went to work, answered emails, attended meetings and smiled when people spoke to her. On the outside she looked calm. But inside her mind was constantly racing. That heart emoji on Tund's phone refused to leave her thoughts. She kept telling herself there must be a simple explanation. Zuri was her sister after all. Maybe they were planning a surprise for her. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. But the strange behavior from both of them continued. One evening, Naledi finished work earlier than expected. The traffic was lighter than usual, so she reached home much sooner than Tund would normally expect. As she quietly unlocked the front door, she noticed something unusual. The house lights were on. She stepped inside slowly, placing her bag on the table without making much noise. Then she heard Tund's voice coming from the balcony. He was on the phone. At first Naledi didn't think anything of it, but then she noticed something strange in the way he was speaking. His voice sounded different, soft, almost affectionate. Naledi stood still for a moment, listening. Tund rarely spoke to her like that anymore. Most of their conversations had become short and practical, about bills, work schedules or family plans, but right now his tone sounded warm, even loving. A nervous feeling crept into Naledi's chest. Without thinking, she quietly walked closer to the balcony door. Her heart started beating faster with every step. Tund was standing with his back to the door, leaning slightly on the railing, looking out into the night. He didn't realize she was home. Then she heard him laugh softly. Not the loud, careless laugh he used with friends. This laugh was quiet and intimate. Naledi held her breath, and then she heard the words that changed everything. If only I had met you first, Zuri, everything would be different. For a moment, Naledi thought she had heard it wrong. Her entire body froze. The world around her seemed to go completely silent. The sound of traffic outside, the humming of the refrigerator, even her own breathing. Everything faded away. Only those words remained in her mind. If only I had met you first, Suri. Naledi felt as if the ground beneath her feet had disappeared. Suddenly that humiliating moment at the dinner table made perfect sense. The cruel joke, the laughter, the strange behavior afterward, the heart emoji on his phone. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't harmless. It was the truth. Her husband wasn't just disrespecting her behind her back. He wasn't just secretly admiring her sister. He was emotionally involved with her. And the most painful part was realizing this had probably been happening for much longer than she ever imagined. After overhearing that phone call on the balcony, Naledi felt like her world had cracked open. For 2 days she barely spoke to Tund. She moved around the house quietly, thinking, watching, and slowly gathering the courage to face the truth. At first she cried alone in the bedroom, asking herself the same painful question again and again. How could they do this to me? But after the tears came something else. Determination. Naledi decided she was not going to stay silent. She needed the truth to come out, not only for herself but for everyone who had been pretending nothing was wrong. A week later, their extended family gathered in Abuja for a large family dinner at her uncle's house. The living room was full of relatives talking, laughing, and passing around plates of food. Zuri was there, smiling and chatting with cousins as if everything in the world was perfectly normal. Tund stood near the dining table, joking with some of the men. Naledi watched both of them quietly. Her heart was beating fast, but her mind was calm. She had already decided what she was going to do. Finally, when everyone was seated and the conversation settled, Naledi stood up. "Before we continue dinner," she said calmly, "there's something I need to talk about." The room slowly became quiet. Everyone turned to look at her. Naledi looked directly at Tund and Zuri. "I know about the two of you." For a moment both of them looked confused. Then Tund gave a small laugh and shook his head. "Naledi, what are you talking about?" he said casually. "Don't start drama at a family dinner." Zuri also forced a nervous laugh. "Yes, sis. What do you mean? You're misunderstanding something." But Naledi didn't move. Instead she slowly picked up her phone. "I wish it was a misunderstanding," she said quietly. Then she turned the screen toward the family members sitting closest to her. On the screen were screenshots, messages between Tund and Zuri. Late-night conversations, heart emojis, flirtatious words that no husband should ever send to his wife's sister. The silence in the room shattered instantly. Relatives began whispering. Some people stood up in shock. Others stared at Tund and Zuri with disbelief. Zuri's face turned pale. "No, this isn't what it looks like," she said quickly, her voice shaking. Tears suddenly filled her eyes. "Naledi, I swear I never meant to hurt you. This happened. We didn't plan it." She started crying, covering her face as if she was the victim. But Naledi's eyes moved to Tund. Unlike Zuri, he didn't look ashamed. He didn't look guilty either. Instead, he looked irritated, like someone tired of a long argument. After a few seconds, he sighed. "Well, since everything is out now," he said, shrugging slightly, "maybe it's better to be honest." The room went completely silent again. Tund glanced briefly at Zuri before looking back at Naledi. "The truth is," he said calmly, "Zuri and I just understand each other better. We always have." Naledi felt her chest tighten. Tund continued speaking without hesitation. "If I'm being honest, I always felt she was the perfect match for me." Gasps spread across the room. Some relatives looked shocked. Others looked angry. But Naledi didn't say anything. She simply stood there, realizing that the man she married wasn't even trying to hide the truth anymore. The betrayal she feared had finally been spoken out loud in front of everyone. After Tund's shocking confession, the entire room exploded with noise. Relatives began talking all at once. Some people were whispering to each other while others openly argued across the table. The peaceful family dinner had suddenly turned into complete chaos. Naledi stood there quietly, expecting at least someone to stand up for her. But what happened next hurt even more than the betrayal itself. Her aunt, Mama Abina, was the first person to speak loudly. She shook her head and looked at Naledi with disappointment. "Naledi, my dear," she said in a serious tone, "sometimes a marriage suffers when a woman focuses too much on work. A husband needs attention too." Naledi blinked in disbelief. For a moment she thought she had heard wrong. Mama Abina continued speaking as if she was giving wise advice. "Maybe you were too busy with your career. Men can feel lonely when their wives are always working. A few relatives nodded quietly. Naledi felt a heavy knot form in her chest. She had worked hard for her career, yes, but she had also supported her husband in every possible way. She had never imagined someone would blame her for his betrayal. Then another cousin spoke from across the room. "Let's be honest," he said with a shrug. "Zuri didn't steal anything. Tund made his own choice." Some people murmured in agreement. The words felt like sharp knives. Naledi slowly looked around the room at the faces of the people she had trusted her entire life. These were the same relatives who used to praise her kindness and responsibility. But now many of them were treating the situation like it was partly her fault. Even Zuri was still crying loudly, sitting with her head down while some family members comforted her. Naledi suddenly felt very alone. It was as if the entire room had decided that keeping the peace was more important than defending the truth. For a moment she thought she might break down right there. But then a gentle hand touched her arm. Naledi turned and saw her grandmother, Nana Ifeoma, standing beside her. The elderly woman had been silent during the entire argument, simply watching everyone carefully. "Naledi," Nana Ifeoma said softly, "come walk with me." They quietly stepped away from the noisy room and moved toward the small garden outside the house. The night air was cooler and calmer there. Naledi finally let out a long breath she didn't realize she had been holding. For a few seconds, Nana Ifeoma didn't say anything. She simply looked at her granddaughter with calm, wise eyes. Then she spoke slowly. "My child, listen to me carefully." Naledi looked at her, waiting. Nana Ifeoma gently held her hand and said words Naledi would never forget. "A woman who tolerates disrespect teaches people how to treat her." Naledi felt those words sink deep into her heart. Her grandmother continued softly, "This situation is painful, yes, but pain can also open your eyes. Now you must decide what kind of life you are willing to accept." For the first time that night, Naledi felt something different inside her. Not just heartbreak, but clarity. After that night in Abuja, Naledi stopped arguing. She didn't cry in front of anyone anymore. She didn't try to convince her family that she was right. Instead she became very quiet. But inside something had changed. Her grandmother's words kept repeating in her mind. "A woman who tolerates disrespect teaches people how to treat her." Naledi realized she had spent too much time trying to keep peace while others walked over her feelings. Now she was ready to think about herself. Back in Nairobi, life continued like nothing had happened. Tund still lived in the house, acting confident, almost arrogant. Sometimes he even behaved like Naledi would eventually forgive everything. Zuri had also stopped calling, clearly avoiding the situation. But Naledi wasn't focusing on them anymore. Instead she started planning. One morning she booked a short business trip to Johannesburg, South Africa. To everyone else it looked like a normal work visit. But Naledi had another important reason for going there. Years earlier she had invested in a small apartment property in Johannesburg. At the time it was simply a smart financial decision. Now it might become something much bigger. During the trip, Naledi scheduled a private meeting with a lawyer who specialized in family law and financial assets. Sitting in the quiet office, she calmly explained her situation and showed him documents about their properties, investments, and business accounts. The lawyer spent a long time reviewing everything carefully. Naledi watched his face, trying to understand what he was thinking. Finally, he looked up at her with a slightly surprised expression. "Mrs. Adeyemi," he said slowly, "do you realize something very important?" Naledi frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" The lawyer tapped several documents on the table. "Most of these investments were funded primarily with your income. And according to the legal paperwork, many of these assets are actually registered under your name." Naledi stared at him. For years she had believed that everything they built together belonged equally to both of them. She had trusted Tund to handle some of the financial paperwork while she focused on growing their investments. But the lawyer continued explaining. "The apartment in Johannesburg is yours. The investment account connected to it is also yours. And several other properties appear to be legally tied to you as the primary owner." Naledi felt a strange mixture of shock and realization. Tund had always acted like he was the powerful one in their marriage. He spoke confidently about their money and their assets as if he controlled everything. But now the truth was becoming clear. In reality, Naledi had funded most of their success. She had been the one working late hours. She had been the one making smart financial decisions. And without realizing it, she had also protected herself legally. For the first time since the betrayal, Naledi felt a quiet sense of power growing inside her. Tund believed she was the weak, emotional wife he could easily replace. What he didn't know was that the future he thought belonged to him might actually belong to her. A few weeks later, the family decided to organize another big dinner. This time it was supposed to fix the problem. Several relatives believed that if everyone sat down together and talked calmly, the situation between Naledi, Tund, and Zuri could somehow be resolved. Naledi agreed to come. The dinner was held at a large house in Abuja again. The dining room looked almost the same as the last gathering. Long table, plates of food, relatives talking in low voices. But the atmosphere was very different this time. People were careful with their words as if everyone was walking on thin ice. When Naledi walked into the room, many eyes immediately turned toward her. She looked calm, confident. Not angry, not emotional, just quiet and composed. Tund was already there, sitting comfortably and speaking with a few cousins. When he saw Naledi enter, he gave a small smile as if nothing serious had happened between them. Zuri was also there, sitting close to some relatives, avoiding Naledi's eyes. After everyone settled down, one of the uncles cleared his throat. "We are all family," he said seriously. "We cannot allow misunderstandings to destroy relationships. Tonight we should speak openly and solve this problem." A few people nodded. Naledi listened quietly for a moment. Then she slowly stood up from her chair. "I agree," she said calmly. "It's time to speak openly." The room immediately became quiet. Naledi reached into her bag and pulled out a folder filled with papers. She placed it gently on the table in front of her. "Tund," she said, looking directly at him, "I want you to hear this clearly in front of everyone." Tund frowned slightly, clearly confused. Naledi opened the folder and took out several official documents. "I have officially filed for divorce," she said calmly. The room froze. Some relatives gasped softly. Others leaned forward, trying to understand what was happening. But Naledi wasn't finished. She continued speaking in the same steady voice. "And according to these legal documents, I am also reclaiming several properties and financial investments that are legally registered under my name." She slowly turned the papers so the relatives sitting nearby could see them. Tund's relaxed expression suddenly disappeared. "What are you talking about?" he said sharply. Naledi met his eyes. "The apartment in Johannesburg," she said. "The investment accounts connected to it. And 2 of the business properties we purchased in Nairobi. They are legally under my ownership." The room fell into complete silence. Tund quickly grabbed one of the papers and began reading it. As his eyes moved across the page, his face slowly changed from confusion to shock. For the first time since all of this began, he looked completely unprepared. "You can't be serious," he said. Naledi remained calm. "I'm very serious." Across the table, Zuri stared at Naledi with wide eyes. Her face had gone pale. For weeks she had probably imagined a future with Tund. Comfortable, secure, maybe even wealthy. But now that future was suddenly falling apart right in front of her. The man she thought had everything was realizing that much of it never truly belonged to him. Tund looked up from the documents, clearly realizing something he had never expected. The quiet wife he had mocked at dinner was the one holding all the power. Months passed after the shocking dinner where Naledi announced the divorce and revealed the truth about the properties. Life slowly began moving in very different directions for everyone involved. At first, Tund and Zuri tried to continue their relationship openly. Since everything had already been exposed to the family, they no longer needed to hide. Some relatives even believed they would eventually become a happy couple. But reality turned out to be very different from what they imagined. When Naledi left the marriage, she also took with her the financial stability that had quietly supported their life for years. The comfortable lifestyle Tund had enjoyed suddenly became much harder to maintain. Several investments he believed were his were gone. The Nairobi house had to be sold during the divorce process, and many expenses began piling up. Slowly, the pressure started affecting their relationship. Without the excitement of secrecy and stolen moments, Tund and Zuri began seeing each other's real personalities more clearly. Small arguments started happening. Zuri complained that Tund had become stressed and impatient. Tund, on the other hand, began realizing that the woman he once thought was perfect wasn't so easy to live with after all. Their conversations became colder. The laughter that once came so easily slowly disappeared. Within a few months, the relationship that had caused so much destruction quietly fell apart. Meanwhile, Naledi's life was moving in the opposite direction. After the divorce was finalized, she decided to start fresh in Cape Town. The beautiful city by the ocean gave her a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. At first, the change felt strange. She was living alone, rebuilding her routines and learning how to enjoy her own company again. But slowly, her confidence returned. Naledi used her experience in business and investments to start a consulting company that helped small businesses grow and manage their finances. At first, she worked with only a few clients, but her reputation quickly grew. People respected her intelligence, her calm leadership, and her ability to solve difficult problems. Within months, her company began attracting bigger clients. Naledi was invited to speak at business events and networking conferences. Industry leaders began recognizing her talent and professionalism. For the first time in a long while, people were noticing her for her strength, not comparing her to anyone else. One evening, Naledi sat on a quiet bench near the ocean in Cape Town, watching the waves crash gently against the shore. The air was cool and the sunset painted the sky with soft orange colors. She thought about everything that had happened, the humiliation at that dinner, the betrayal, fame. But she also realized something important. Without that painful moment, she might have stayed in a life where she was constantly undervalued. The betrayal that once broke her heart had also forced her to discover her true strength. It was a quiet evening in Cape Town. The sky had turned a deep purple, and the sound of waves crashing softly against the shore filled the air. Naledi sat on the balcony of her apartment, a cup of tea warming her hands, thinking about the journey that had brought her here. Her phone buzzed on the table. When she picked it up, a message notification caught her eye. It was from Tund. Her heart skipped for a moment, but she already knew she had no interest in reading words meant to manipulate her emotions. Still, curiosity got the better of her. She opened the message. The words were simple but heavy with regret. Tund admitted he had made a terrible mistake. He wrote that he had destroyed the best relationship he ever had. He begged for another chance, saying he finally understood what he had lost and how badly he had hurt her. Naledi read the message quietly, letting each word sink in. There was no anger in her expression, only calm understanding. She closed the message, feeling no need to respond, and tapped delete. The phone slipped back onto the table, silent and powerless. She leaned back and looked out over the Atlantic Ocean. The wind brushed her face, and the waves reflected the colors of the setting sun. For the first time in months, she felt completely free. Everything she had endured, the humiliation, the betrayal, the family drama, had led her to this moment. The husband who once mocked her at a family dinner, who had humiliated her in front of everyone, had unknowingly taught her the most valuable lesson of her life. Sometimes betrayal hurts so deeply because it is preparing you for freedom. Naledi took a deep breath, feeling stronger, calmer, and wiser than ever before. She smiled softly to herself. Her life was no longer defined by anyone else's choices. She was in control, and she finally knew her own worth.